Okay, good afternoon everybody, and thank you so much of you for being here. My name is Jim O'Neill and I am honoured to chair this discussion. I think I have been asked to do this primarily because, as I'm sure some of you know, I had the great pleasure of chairing an independent review into antimicrobial resistance under the David Cameron government, which I'll come back to touch on in a second, which was possibly one of the, in fact, definitely probably the most singly interesting thing I've ever done in my professional life. And some of it is highly relevant to the fascinating things we're about to hear. But my main purpose, other than reflecting a little bit on that, is to help launch the report, The People's Prescription: Reimagining Health Innovation to Deliver Public Value. Let me, first of all, in this regard, thank the hosts and writers of this report, the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, STOPAIDS, Global Justice Now, and Just Treatment. In terms of the aim of the report, it's primarily to set out a new vision, I think is right in saying, for a health innovation model that is driven by public health need and delivers products at prices patients and health systems can afford. And the report in this regard presents a very thorough analysis of the way R&D in the biomedical space is currently conducted, and highlights repeatedly the potential and often realistic misalignments between market-driven agendas and public health priorities. Let me, at this stage, in that context, reflect back with just four comments, what is it now, 2.5 years after our review formally published, and just over 2 years ago since the high-level agreements on AMR at the UN. The first thing I would say is, to my slight surprise, as an optimist in life, and maybe I'm leading this way more anyhow, there is some momentum on some policy initiatives about aspects of our recommendations, although not as it relates to the role of the broken model for antibiotics and the role played by pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of noise, but not much actual action. Second thing I would say, as a sort of part provocateur to Mariana, who I'm going to introduce in a second, is in that space, and probably in broader medical spaces, but particularly in that space, I concluded during that process, and since even more, that as important as it is to get new drugs, actually the role of demand reduction, so in terms of things like diagnostics to stop the over-dependency on things that won't help, is probably more important than the whole search for new drugs, because particularly as it relates to antibiotics, as most people in here will know way better than me, these bug things are pretty clever and will find a way of getting resistance probably to whatever the hell it is that comes up. The third thing I will say, which I just discussed briefly with Mariana, is particularly interesting in the context of what you're about to hear. Amongst the positive areas of progress is the aggregate money going into early stage research, or what I guess is called the push funding, is actually at least as big as what we called for in terms of over a 5-year period, a global $2 billion of new innovation funding. It is inspired and kicked off really by public bodies, but intriguingly, there are a number of private sector participants that I see evidence of, again, just this week, getting into this space, which I think is a bit of a challenge to aspects of what you say. But what is clear, and one of the detailed parts of what we spent so much time in our review, is how you link the genuine VC early stage with actually bringing these things to market. And as I said before, despite endless chatter, I never thought people could talk about nonsense as much as the world of finance that I came from, but my God, big pharmaceutical companies really do a good job on that. The general trends of the few big pharmaceutical companies that are in this space is going in the wrong direction. with more and more of the few that have been at least trying to do something actually showing signs of pulling out. And so in that part of it, and I'm sure it's true of many other things, we have some significant market failure issues that probably does require, in my view, a much bigger role for public intervention. And in that regard, and linking it directly to the sort of core theme that at least I take away from this, one of the first things I thought of 4 weeks after when we first started, and I couldn't even pronounce antimicrobial resistance, never mind know anything about it, was the solution is to create a new G20-owned body which was publicly owned, and just take, in terms of new drugs, just take the private sector out of it. And I, after exploring that with a couple of people, I was told, don't be so naive. These guys, and my interpretation of this was, these guys might be balance sheet managers, but they do know how to manufacture and distribute pills. And it was something that I regret parking, because what I see here is some sort of basis of a version of something like that, or maybe I'm wrong. So there we go. Let me now get on to my proper job as chairing. First of all, we're going to hear from Mariana, who is the director of the Institute of Innovation for Public Purpose, and of course one of the lead authors of this report. And I should add, as an observer of how economists develop, in my view, becoming rapidly one of the most influential thinkers about many issues to do with modern industrial strategy and public interest that I know of anywhere. And it's fantastic that she has committed herself to this. And of course, as I'm sure you know, partly related to this, she has a highly acclaimed book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths. And there is another one, which I have just got my signed copy of, which I told her I actually already have one because my daughter is obsessed about your brilliance and bought me one for Christmas. But this one is signed. So I'm sure there are some copies outside for others to purchase who haven't, the few that haven't got them yet. Anyhow, I am going to turn you over to Mariana in a second. And then after she has finished, the other wonderful people we have here, I'm going to invite to comment on what they've heard in the form of questions to them, and I shall tell you who they are when it gets around to that. So thank you very much for all being here, and over to you, Mariana.
So thank you, Jim. I must say that you're the perfect symbol of so much of what we're going to talk about today, which is, sort of courage to fight a battle, the whole AMR review, which was done, I think, really well, also in terms of the different stakeholders that you brought into the conversation. But also, as chief economist of Goldman Sachs, which helped fuel the last financial crisis, and then all the kind of mea culpa and thinking within the financial sector of how do we actually reform the economy, including definancializing it. Again, you've been a really important, I think, spokesman for that. And I think we're going to be bringing up in the conversation today, I sure will, this whole question of finance. Finance isn't neutral. How we actually finance things ends up affecting what actually happens in particular sectors. But first, this was very, very much of a collective effort, and you see all our banners and propaganda here behind us. Let me just say the key organizations involved besides IIPP, which is a new department at UCL. There's Global Justice Now, Just Treatment, STOPAIDS, and also the funder, at least for our part of it, the UCL part of it, the Open Society Foundation. And inside the room are some of these individuals from those organizations that were also authors. So Heidi Chow from Global Justice Now, Saoirse Fitzpatrick from STOPAIDS, Dermot McDonald from Just Treatment, Ellen Hone, I don't think she's here, but she's from Medical Medicines and Policy. And then from the IIPP team, there was different people involved, including Andrea Laplan, Tiziana Massini, who worked an immense amount on it as a postdoc funded by the grant, Victor Roy and Henry Lee, who just joined us. We're very happy to have him. He just joined us a couple months ago. Anyway, so what we're going to be talking about actually goes to the heart of what the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose cares about, and the reason why we're also a department and not just sort of a policy outfit. We actually believe that we need new teaching programs, we need new types of training in order really to think about the kind of issues that we'll be talking about today around, say, public value and public purpose, and not just the rate of growth, but its direction and how that direction is actually set in this more collective ways. There isn't really a strong framework for that in economics, so we often, when we do think about different types of policies that are needed, whether it be in this kind of health space or the future of the digital economy, unfortunately, we get very quickly into a sort of a fixing mode, right? Fix different types of market failures. And that's sort of the economic speak, but just think of, fixing a problem when it arises. And at the center of this report is the view that actually what we require is a much more ambitious agenda about co-creating and co-shaping markets between the different actors in a system, and that obviously includes business. This is not meant to be, and it shouldn't read like an anti-business report. There's different types of businesses, small, medium, large. There's different types of public agencies and actors and departments, and they themselves can be structured in different ways. There's a very important role for civil society organizations and philanthropies. I always tell people, don't forget that capitalism wouldn't be capitalism without trade unions who fought for the 8-hour workday and weekends, right? So even those kinds of voices have always been incredibly important for actively shaping markets. Anyway, let me go on, otherwise I'll finish my time just talking about these big, broad issues. This is the punchline. This is sort of the slide that tells you the whole story. So what we've tried to do in the report is precisely what I just said, right? What would it look like to kind of almost start from scratch, but being inspired by what's actually happening out there. So this shouldn't be seen as a dream thing, but very much from a co-shaping and co-creating agenda. And so instead of just worrying about, prices are too high, how do we get them down by bringing in an organization like NICE, N-I-C-E, which in this country is very important for negotiating prices down when they're too high, how would we actually perhaps even align the system, this huge amount of public funding around the world that goes into the actual basic research and also applied research, how maybe could that research spending be better aligned so it's better matched also to this massive demand side power that governments have, again, all over the world from their welfare state angle, right? The actual purchase of drugs in order to get the drugs to the people, right? The access, the inclusive growth kind of agenda. Why are these so separate? Why is it that we think of one just in terms of the welfare state and the other one in terms of wealth creation? What would it look like, for example, to even learn from some other sectors? And there, unfortunately, the defense sector is one of the more inspirational. We don't like to think about war as inspirational, but the defense sector has not been as naive, if you want. We'll argue that the health industry has been in terms of putting in all that money upstream and then kind of just hoping for the best that it actually reaches the clients. So this more mission-oriented approach. And then some more kind of specific things, in fact, about the kind of granular organizing of the system, so it also delinking the incentive for innovating from the actual price, right? That wouldn't matter so much for luxury cars. It definitely matters for an area that is basically, in the end, about human rights. And I know we have some patients in the room from the Just Treatment organization who they've been talking to who might want to speak to this later. And also, this is, I'm not joking when I say that this is not anti-business. Of course it's not, right? But the question is, there's relationships. And what is the relationship between, for example, when you do have this big public spend, like in the US, it's over 30 billion a year. I think this year was actually 37 billion in the previous year. What is then the kind of contract, the relationship between that spend and the businesses that can rightly so, if you want, profit from it, right? But how much profit? And what is the condition in terms of, the kind of give and take? Here's 32 billion or 35 billion. What might be the conditions in terms of what then the ask is on the business side? If these businesses were acting as just atomistic molecules in the system and really on their own, well, then let them do what they want. But because they are actually part of a very strong ecosystem, also benefiting, again, rightly, if you want, from this great public spend, what are the actual conditions in place and what could be stronger conditions in order that we actually build an ecosystem, this trendy word that everyone likes to use, in a more symbiotic and a more mutualistic way. And dare I say, not a parasitic way. biologists are not naive when they use the word ecosystems. They immediately say, what kind? Is it predator-prey? Is it parasitic? Is it symbiotic? What would a symbiotic mutualistic ecosystem look like in this sector? And we look at different types of conditions, of which some are just, some are monetary, but others are very much behavioral. And this whole issue, again, that there are these different organizations in the sector, what do we know about how they're governed? In this issue of corporate governance and whether maximizing shareholder value might be okay, again, for luxury cars, perhaps not for something as important as health is. And that's that last bit there, which I think we probably will all agree with, but maybe not, depends who's in the room. Anyway, so I just mentioned this huge spend, but this isn't just in the U.S. I mean, this is the National Institutes of Health spending in the U.S. that even after the crisis continued to rise. In fact, Trump, by the way, is the first U.S. president to actually put at risk some of these big public pots in the U.S. that I talked about in the entrepreneurial state in terms of the DARPAs, the NIHs, the SBIRs. But in the UK, there's the Medical Research Council, there's the NIH's research body, NHSR, there's the charities, and between them, they also have a very large amount, if you want, of money that they're putting into the system. And the real question then is, this isn't actually about how much money is going in from public or private, but how is it actually then being directed to make sure that we actually produce something called, if you want, public value. And so what I'm going to do in the beginning here is sort of follow the outline of the report and just kind of go through extremely quickly 4 of the biggest problems in the sector, just so we kind of have a common vocabulary and understanding of at least what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and it'll be extremely quick. The first is this whole issue of direction. And, again, Jim was leading, the AMR review, which very much, if you want, highlighted the problems where some areas were completely underfinanced, but we also have John Abrams here in the room. Sorry to embarrass you, John, right there. He's also talked about directionality in other ways, and he's talked about it in terms of the pharmaceuticalization of the sector. So much money on drugs, not enough on areas like diagnostics, surgical treatments, and lifestyle. And I'm talking about serious research on lifestyle, which would really help a lot of the preventative area. So again, given that there is lots of this public and also third sector finance, what is the actual discussion about how to really kind of be much more a thorn in the side of even how we talk about the market being just, beyond drugs. The other thing is this lack of transparency and stifled collaboration. This is really important, especially when we look at patents, so intellectual property rights. This is also not a manifesto against patents. We are not naive. We're not saying get rid of them. Patents can, especially in this sector, not in software, actually help, if structured properly, help actually incentivize innovation. And the real problem is what has been allowed to happen around IPR is they have become increasingly strong and increasingly wide. Increasingly going upstream, so the tools for research are being patented. That's actually quite new. And increasingly strong, meaning not very easily licensable, and increasingly wide in terms of actually just using patents like dogs. Is it dogs or cats that pee in order to stake out their territory? So actually not really about novelty, but actually preventing other actors from even coming close. And we think this is very problematic, and we can, talk about it. These are contracts. Patents are not brought down from God. These are contracts. They're 20-year monopolies that the state actually gives to a private sector company, but that again should be in exchange for the fact that then you actually write down everything, so we don't have the secrecy we had in the Middle Ages. We actually have a greater ability for these innovations to have an impact once that patent is up. But if in the meantime they've been structured in problematic ways, they actually stifle innovation. And in fact, this figure, which many people, especially the Financial Times, tends to put this out every year when they have their big pharma conference, this falling rate of innovation, where in the 1950s there was about 40 drugs coming out for every $1 billion of R&D, and now it's only 1 drug for every $1 billion of R&D. There's been quite a bit of discussion about that, but I think this issue about restructuring, rethinking how the patent system works to actually get a more innovative type of collaboration has been underemphasized, and we focus a lot on that. There's this very obvious question around access. I think it was about 2 weeks ago, the price of an antibiotic by Nostrum Pharmaceuticals went up by 400% overnight, and the CEO said, well, we actually have a moral imperative to allow prices to rise to the level that the market will actually bear, and also, please our shareholders along the way. And we just think, again, that might be okay for a gadget that is not really needed. Is that okay for an area like health? Absolutely not. And so we also question this whole issue around how the high prices are being justified, for example, through the theory of value-based pricing, which is basically allowing prices to be in the eye of the beholder. How much do you actually value the drug if you weren't treated by it? We actually have a working paper with Victor Roy just looking at that question. And it's not that particular, it's not that value-based pricing is the reason why the prices have gone up. We talk about all the different problems around costs and collaborations, et cetera, but they definitely help to justify those very high prices, which we think are problematic. And it's very nice when Goldman Sachs asks these really, stark, smart questions like, perhaps curing patients is actually a bad business model, given that the business model is actually based on also being able to charge these very high prices, which then prevent people to access them. Right, then lastly, this issue around corporate governance. And this is really a sector that has suffered massively from being what I would call overly financialized, so profits being earned, which are quite high. Of course, there's also failure rates, in particular R&D experiments, but one could not negate that this is one of the most profitable sectors close to the banking sector. And the degree, so that itself is interesting, and when we questioned, how profits are actually being generated, precisely because, profits are the price and the cost times the revenue. So we look at both those sides, but also whether these profits are also being reinvested back into the system or not. And by financialized, I mean, let me just bring up some data here. If you look at the big pharma companies, you have Pfizer, Gilead, Amgen, Merck here, you see that the stock buyback, so purchasing back your shares to boost stock prices, to boost stock options, boost, surprise, surprise, executive pay, it's not exactly that linearly, is extremely high as a percentage of net income. And the combination, actually, of share buybacks and dividends are often over 100% of net income, so actually going into capital expenditures. So we think that all of these different issues that have extremely quickly gone through are, if you want, parts of the really problematic symptoms of the industry in terms of the sickness, if you want. It's a thermometer down the throat of the sector. And so what we do is we look at, we ask, well, first of all, we look at these different pillars. Before we even look at the remedies, we say, what would it look like actually to really transform the sector? So this issue around direction of innovation was much more explicit. We value collaboration and transparency because innovation itself in all different sectors actually thrives on real collaboration and not, again, using the patent system to stifle that. What would it look like even to define innovation itself? In terms of also whether these great products are, then made accessible. And what would it look like actually to really rethink the financing of the system, both in terms of where the finance is coming from, but also the corporate governance of the company so that we have longer term horizons and more patient, less impatient capital. And when we look at the remedies, I'm going to focus almost nothing on the sort of immediate policy actions because this has been talked about quite a bit also in other reports, and they're the kind of more obvious ways in which one might reduce prices, for example, through volume-based pooling, which, for example, in Australia allowed the price for hepatitis C, the I can never pronounce it, sofosbuvir drug, to be 8,000 for every 8,000 pounds for a 12-week cycle instead of a 35,000 pounds, which it is here in the UK. So this use of, again, if you want, government purchasing power and negotiating over the pooling of that to reduce prices. And other mechanisms around also how to restructure the patent system towards, I really want to focus on these more transformative proposals because this is where we think there's been really very little attention, and this is precisely where we think this mission-oriented approach could be very useful if it's really thought about, again, collectively between the different stakeholders of what would it actually look like if the upstream and the downstream demand-side power in terms of the purchasing power of governments really be done more ambitiously. Right, so sorry, this was the slide on the quick remedies. So on these more transformative ways, the first one is, again, this mission-oriented approach. And the idea was, why don't we, why hasn't there actually been real thinking about something like HARPA? And then we found out actually there is something called HARPA, but it's in the closet, or if you want, drawer in the US Congress. They've sort of thought about it in the back rooms, but it's actually never come, it's never come up in terms of real national discussion. And the idea here is, DARPA, which was very important, and in fact, if you want, trying to use government financing to actually solve problems. Going to the moon was a problem of NASA. Along the way, all sorts of different innovations occurred that are in our iPhones. DARPA has been a very important agency around that. Driverless cars are, one of the latest innovations coming out of those types of funding, where a problem is set and then prizes are used to really drive in and crowd in different types of private activity. Why not actually also think about HARPA-type organizations, where instead of just using public money to fuel, if you want, an innovation system, the problem itself that then is, if you want, used to crowd in the different actors is done much more explicitly. And again, delinking, if you want, the activity, the way that you crowd in actors from the price system itself. And again, prize schemes are very interesting. And in fact, we talked to Jeffrey Ling, who was actually the head of biotech for DARPA, and he's the person who's actually come up with this idea. And it is quite striking that, again, there's no discussion about this in the US, but it's precisely that kind of thinking that we thought was actually quite useful just to start off this more transformational debate. The second is this whole kind of delinking of innovation funding from high prices. So again, what are, in fact, the instruments that could be used like prizes that could really delink the incentives for innovation from the price itself? And here, again, we don't have to look very far. I mean, there are obviously tools like that are being used, whether it's through the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDI, the Cancer Innovation Fund, the Life Prize. But the lessons from these, what would be very interesting, and this might become part of the discussion we have in the Q&A, is what would the system actually look like if it was driven by these kinds of principles, instead of these just remaining sort of exceptions on the side, and then, again, the current business model really being used to, if you want, define the actual more systemic properties. This, I think, is one of the most interesting things in the report, which is, again, not about being anti-business. That would be very, if you want, not very productive, but what are, in fact, the right conditions that might actually be framing this more symbiotic and mutualistic ecosystem, whether they be about conditions on reinvestment, and that's really, if you want, targeting that share buyback problem, the financialization problem, conditions around knowledge sharing. Again, the Human Genome Project, very interesting in terms of the very strict conditions there were around patents and the need for collaboration, conditions on transparency. Before value-based pricing, there was this whole thing about prices needing to be high in order to recoup the costs of R&D, until it would, different people, including Marcia Angel, really unveiled who was really spending on the really high, uncertain R&D upstream. And this is where lots of the data that I was talking about before comes up in terms of, for example, the NIH and other big public actors. But really kind of conditions on transparency of the R&D costs across that whole innovation chain, in order to make sure that we have a more collective also sharing of the rewards themselves, and of course conditions for access and affordability. I'll stop in 2 seconds. And this issue, I already raised it in terms of corporate governance. So that's it. And so I just want to say, if this was an anti-business report, it could really just be thrown out, because what you said, Jim, in terms of perhaps, what we need to really think through is who's kind of doing what. And if the private pharmaceutical companies, of course, need to be in there in order to manufacture and to think about, also some of the clinical trials, well, then it wouldn't be as profitable of an industry, would it? Because you'd almost be in there to, kind of doing, I don't want to say what Walmart does, but it wouldn't be structured as it currently is. And this is really what we're trying to think. What might be a more healthy, interesting division of innovative labor, which also then produces the kind of, drugs and other things, John, that we need in such a way that, the consumers and the people, the citizens, can actually access the goods from this collectively created system.
Very good.
Mariana, thank you so much for that. Some incredibly
interesting ideas and the least you would expect of something that you would be at the core of. I'm going to turn to our esteemed panel in a second, but before I do, I need to remind you of something I should have said earlier, that we're going to follow some opening comments from each of the four with a Q&A from yourselves, and there's a thing for you to all ponder in how you ask questions. That is going to be separating you all and us from a drinks reception in the atrium afterwards. So remember that when you ask questions as opposed to make big speeches. So let me, with that, first of all, turn to Mariangela here on my left. Mariangela Simo, who since November 2017 has been the Assistant Director General Access to Medicines, Vaccine and Pharmaceuticals at the WHO, following an illustrious career elsewhere, including working before that since 2010 at UNAIDS, and prior to that the Ministry of Health in Brazil, where she oversaw and implemented policies including universal and free of charge access to treatment care and comprehensive preventive programs. So to kick you off, Mariangela, these guys here are so careful in how they guide. They know me too well. They've guided me to ask you things as opposed to what I would ask. Could you reflect on the history of the R&D debate at the WHO and how this debate has shifted over time, if it has, and where you feel this report fits with the current initiatives that the WHO are supporting and trying to promote for the needs-driven R&D and affordable medicine? Nice, easy challenge.
Thank you very much. I'm not very much for following script, and I already have my notes, and I will have difficulty following them here because I scribbled so much on them. But thank you very much for inviting WHO to come. And I think some people here already heard me speak in the past days because we come from the World Health Summit in Berlin, and access to medicines was a big hot topic there as well. So apologies for those who heard me already. I always like when I'm talking about access is to think about the moral high ground, right? Because we when you're talking about R&D, anything related to health technologies, the moral high ground is that at the end of the day, people should not die or suffer if there are technologies that can save them or treat them adequately. I think that's the basics where we need to be really sure. And now we have that R&D being used. The cost of R&D have been used long time, as a reason why high-priced medicines are on the market, right? And I don't think many people around this room believe that. Right? I think that has been proven by so many different ways. And at the same time that we have right now rich countries worried about high costs of medicines, you also have the linkage between costs of R&D and final pricing gets stuck globally and doesn't move. So you have a dilemma. In one hand you have these developed countries now worried after Sofosbuvir, but the discussion doesn't move. And it's not for lack of WHO resolutions or decisions by the World Health Assembly. The World Health Assembly this year approved that WHO should develop an access to medicines and vaccines roadmap. And this is going to be presented now in January for the Executive Board and then for appreciation of the Assembly next year. But this doesn't come out of the blue because we had to, when we wrote a proposal for this access to medicine roadmap, we found 100 resolutions from WHO related to access to medicine. So it's not about the framing, it's not about mandate. We have a lot of mandate, right? And even the global strategy on innovation, intellectual property, and public health with dates from 2008. And right now, we just got approved decreasing from 108 recommendations, because 108 is paralyzing, to 33 recommendations. So it's work in process, and WHO is scheduled. It has to provide an implementation plan for that. One thing that we have, I noticed that the time is running out fast. The report says that new doesn't mean better, and I think we've got ample evidence of that. And a question that we have to place for governments, which why grant access to your market if you don't create a benefit for all in the market? So there are rules that the governments can do. Can make and use the legislation they have to try to regulate a little bit. And I would say that what are the true public health innovations? And then I think government should also rely more on their essential medicines list, because it's a good tool, it's very evidence-based, and it could help to actually advance the agenda, the access agenda for those true innovations that actually benefit patients. On the other thing that Mariana raised here on the value of a medicine, and I heard this from a CEO of one of these 5 big companies that were named here, saying, when we were talking about costs, and he came for a visit, and he was saying, no, but it's not about how much it costs to develop. It's how much the market will pay for it. And that's the jungle principle. Right, because, and then you have the case of sofosbuvir, right? When the argument was, but it costs much less than a liver transplant would cost. But who gets a liver transplant? It's very few people. So I think this all come to the agenda. We are going to present a cancer pricing report now to the executive board, where several of the recommendations in your report are also on the cancer pricing report. I think it's going to be one of the hot topics it should be out in like 2 or 3 weeks. It should be on the web. I have to finish. I think on the patent protection, and I speak from experience because I led the compulsory license of Favirenz in Brazil from the Ministry of Health side. It's not an easy choice. It's a very complicated thing. So the rules of the game are there. And if you have the legal framework in the country and the political will to do, even so it's very difficult. Malaysia now is suffering lots of threats of retaliation. And so it's not an easy way to go, but it's something people say, oh no, you cannot get voluntary license from the patent pool, but you could get you can go and do a compulsory license. It's for the strong to do a compulsory license. It's a lot of pressure. Finally, let me say something that I said in Berlin, because health technology was named as the most profitable area industry in the world in 2016. So we're not talking about, people having to cover their losses. No, it's very healthy. On the other hand, we call health industry, but it's actually a disease industry, right? And we need to think of how we can frame this better. I think we need a very, very much a more balanced approach where pharma should not be considered equal to a car parts manufacturer. That's we're dealing. Yep, and I said this publicly. It's absolutely true because it has to have a higher calling than just shareholders' profit, and I think we really need to work hard on that. And there are many partners on this, including some more enlightened CEOs from pharma. So let's think about that. How is it that we create a new global environment that this can be discussed? Thank you.
So, Mariangela, on that very interesting final note, I have to say that some of you know I've recently become chair of Chatham House, and one of my big missions in life is I describe it more broadly as profit with purpose, and it's certainly necessary in the pharmaceutical industry, in my view. Rapidly moving on. Next, we are delighted to have Calypso with us. Calypso Chalkadou, as I'm sure many of you know, is the Director of Global Health Policy for the Centre for Global Development based here in London, as well as being Professor of Practice in Global Health at Imperial. She has been fantastically involved in some key things of the health world here in the UK, including the establishment of NICE International, a non-profit group within the UK's NICE overall framework for 8 years, I think, right? And more recently has become a director of the International Decision Support Initiative, which is a multi-million country network towards better health around the world through evidence-informed spending in healthcare in low to middle-income countries. Now, Calypso has to leave at 5, so I shouldn't go on any more about your incredible background. So just to inform you, but let me start you off with a question I have also been guided on. So the top-line message from this report is that we seem to need a system for developing health innovations that deliver public value. From your experiences, particularly running NICE International, can you give us a flavour of how such health technology assessments can play a role in discerning value and the challenges in quantifying value, particularly in light of the, this is a word I've been asked, all of these words, not necessarily I'm saying this, but the apparent lack of transparency around R&D investments.
I thought that might not have been you.
So I guess what I would say is that what we need to do is to be more to have more evidence-informed haggling qualities, and I think we're not good enough at negotiating. And I don't think value-based pricing or health technology assessment, or the stuff NICE does, is inconsistent to what you're calling for. And in response to your question, I think NICE has been pretty good at setting up a process, a governance running a process that allows it to negotiate. And it's been pretty bad at ensuring that its decision rules are well enough calibrated and correspond to the budgetary constraint as this changes, as the economics of a country and the priorities change. And I think we've got enough information now to come up with a lot better thresholds, if you like, for decision making that correspond to the budgetary constraint and correspond to the productivity of the healthcare system. And one of the reasons why most recently the National Health Service came up with this sort of £20 million cap to spending, even when NICE says yes to something, is precisely because of the inflationary pressures of NICE in its negotiations, because it's been perhaps a bit too generous based on the information you have about what the NHS can buy within a certain pot of money. So I think, I'm not sure we need a lot more transparency on R&D costs. I think what you put out there speaks for itself. You've got less than 20% spend on R&D and a lot more spend on public relations and direct lobbying and advertising to patients and paying for people to go to conferences and be educated, including prescribers of medicines, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a lot going into that and much, much less going into R&D. Now, how much exactly goes into R&D? I'm not that bothered. I think what we do need to know is we need to know whether this new thing that's just come onto the market is better than what we already have, and the regulatory information doesn't give us that. So is it better than what we have as opposed to better to nothing? And we need to understand also the budgetary constraints within which we operate. How much is the budget of the National Health? We can aspire to grow the budget, but right here, right now, there is a limit. And also understand the competing demands on this budget by others, be it more nurses or doctors or building a hospital, having more surgery or buying another drug. And when we pull all this together, then we can haggle better. And we can pull NHS's purchasing power or other buyers' purchasing power, because I think there's a big risk, or perhaps two big risks, in driving prices down through pooled procurement without having any idea of the evidence of comparative effect. The first is we end up buying cheaply things that don't work. A lot of the time, NICE looks at things which would not be cost effective even if they were priced at zero. The French equivalent of NICE identified that about 85% of products in the past few years are actually worse than what was there already. So we don't want access to all of the things industry produces, even if they were really cheap. So that's the first thing to say. And the second risk is that when you're pushing prices down without an understanding of the structure of the price, especially in developing nations, you could end up in a difficult situation, as is the case, for instance, in India, where the government capped prices and there's no drugs now in rural areas. I'm over-exaggerating, but basically there's been issues with drugs reaching people in poor rural areas because prices were capped for the benefit of the people. And in Indonesia, where we've got an influx of substandard medicines because, again, government in the context of the drive towards universal coverage has capped prices and pushed prices down. And the final point I want to make, and I think matters, is, and we should raise it here, is that when WHO talks about 100 to 150 million people going poor every year because they have to spend on drugs, these are not the people who are spending on Herceptin or Avastin or the latest biologic for multiple myeloma. These are people who are spending on generics in markets that are dysfunctional and don't work well, in markets where there's graft, in markets where the costs of forex and the costs of distributing the drug to people who need them are far too great. And this has got nothing to do with patents. It has a lot to do with dysfunctional markets. So that needs solving. And our colleague from WHO talked about the power of the essential medicines list. That needs promoting and solving. So anyway, I think it's wonderful to be here and to have this conversation. I think being able to tackle some of these rent-seeking activities like lobbying, advertising, evergreening, paying doctors to prescribe. Part B in the United States, you can prescribe a drug as a clinician, a cancer drug, and then a proportion of the cost of the drug goes into your bank account. I mean, what worse incentive can there be for? So, being able to address all of these matters. But I think the NHS is not doing too bad a job, and I think it could do a much better job if we were to be a little bit bolder about what it can actually afford and be more explicit about the real value that these new drugs that are coming on the market actually offer. And pay quite a bit for things that work, but refuse others, and inform people as to why this is happening. I think NICE has become a lot worse in doing this than the early days of its existence in the early 2000s. Thank you.
Calypso, thank you so much for your brevity and clarity. So now we're going to turn to Martin McKee, who is Medical Director and Professor of European Public Health at the the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as Research Director at the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies, which is a partnership of governments, international agencies and universities. And there are many other things as well, but in the interest of time, I won't take up Martin or anybody else's. So Martin, here's my guided question for you. Reflecting on this report's recommendations around the need to be equitably balanced in terms of risks and rewards amongst public and private actors, could you give us a forward-looking take, big challenge here, mate, on what good models of public-private partnerships should look like, given what we know about the shortcomings of existing ones and how public health leadership, I emphasise, not my words, can be reinstated?
Okay. Thanks very much. Well, I think the real reason I've been invited here is that I'm a member of the European Commission's expert panel on investing in health, and we produced our report, Innovative Payment Models for High-Cost Innovative Medicines, which I have to say is actually not quite as good as yours, Mariana. So I could just say I agree with Mariana and sit down, and that probably would be a good idea, but as I've got a few minutes to fill, I thought I would rehearse some of not the models, but the principles that we put forward. And there were a lot of things that you've touched on, like shareholder buyback and so on, we didn't look at, and pricing of generics. That was sort of outside our scope. But what we did do, and it was interesting that we wrote them independently, but many of the conclusions were the same. So we identified the importance of greater price and cost transparency, but we also realized that there are actually a lot of challenges here because, of course, those who control the accounts can present them in all sorts of ways, and if you're a shareholder in Patisserie Valerie, you will know this at the present time, and so it is quite challenging. So there are quite a few challenges in doing that, and we thought It's not just enough to say it has to be transparent. We need to go beyond there. We also had concerns about the existing system of HTA with cost effectiveness thresholds and the incentive to go up to that threshold rather than come down below it. And also, as you have said, to take account of the return on investment that should come back to the public funding that goes in. So greater price and cost transparency was a first principle. A second one was to remind ourselves of the fundamental principle that patents are about promoting innovation. And they're not about rent-seeking and not about all sorts of other things, really. I mean, that's what effectively they have become. But we had a lot of concerns about that. And we did say that although compulsory licensing should obviously never be routine, it certainly should be held in reserve. And it should be a realistic challenge to say, we can actually use it when we need to. The third was that we also emphasised the delinkage of R&D from profits. We also talked about prizes, as you do, and we think that that has an important role. But we, I think, need to unbundle the different components. We talked about unbundling the phase 3 of the drug development from the earlier stages, looking at how that works and so on. We had a recommendation. We talked about the role of the EMA, but of course the EMA has its own challenges at the present time as it seeks to relocate. But value, a really key issue, and in fact one of our next reports will be on value, because we didn't come to a firm conclusion. We think the problem is that value in healthcare is a bit like something out of Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, where words mean what we choose them to mean, and everybody has a different interpretation of them. And do we mean value for the patients, value for society, value for shareholders, value for who? And I think we need to be very careful about using this terminology when we really, with different people, mean different things. We talked a bit more about competition than you do, I think, and that was because we felt that competition regulators often don't really understand the pharmaceutical market. Because they're used to, as you talked about, you said it's not the same as car parts and so on, but often the models that are applied are those that are developed from other areas, and you cannot substitute a medicine for a particular disease for another one. We talked about new models of rewarding therapeutic innovation, and again you go rather further. But we also looked at this issue that has come up a little bit about the fact that medicines are not the only contributor to why people are impoverished, and the whole move towards away from medicines as a product to medicines as a service as part of a package of integrated care. So for example, if we look at a condition like diabetes in large parts of the world, of course there is the cost of insulin. That is a real problem. But the biggest cost for many people is test strips. Because, of course, the manufacturers of test strips have taken a model like the printer cartridge or the razor blades, where they give away the glucometers but then charge a fortune for test strips that are proprietary and cannot be swapped from one to another. And again, looking at the whole package of this and the impact. We talked about non-linear payment systems whereby a drug is licensed and priced on the basis that it will be used in a small group of patients, but once it gets out there, then it's used in a much wider group, and the market is much bigger than we expect it to be. And with SSRIs, we know that only about 4% of the population who actually ultimately got the drug would have met the criteria for being in the original clinical trials. And we talked about the need for dialogue. But also, and I think where we one of the issues that we came up with, because we got quite stuck in a lot of these things, we couldn't come up with one model because we thought that there are different issues that need to be addressed for different types of medicines. And clearly we have the Drugs for Neglected Disease initiatives, which we think is good, and which is interesting because it shows that the cost of producing a drug, discovery and development, can be a lot less than the figures that are bandied about in the general dialogue. You can actually bring those costs down. But there are neglected diseases, and we need to look very carefully, not just at the cost of discovery and development, but the whole cost of providing them. How do we actually get them out? This issue about how do you get drugs into rural India, although our research in India suggests that actually India stands out in the world among low and middle income countries as having much better access than most other countries, even in rural areas. But I take your point, it's still far from ideal. But then for other conditions it's going to be different, and for cancer drugs it might be different, and so on. So we need to be looking very carefully at each of the different categories. For antibiotics, there's clearly an issue because, of course, you don't actually, you want to produce antibiotics, but you don't want people to use them. I mean, extending the patent life is no point. There's no point in that whatsoever. If resistance kicks in before the expiry of the patent, why would anybody invest? And, of course, Lord O'Neill, you've addressed this at length. So the real point of standing up here, basically, and speaking for 7 minutes, is to say I agree with Mariana. We came to very much the same conclusions, although you did go further than us in some ways, and we picked up a few things that you didn't. But interesting that we did actually come up with essentially the same diagnosis. Thanks.
Thank you,
So, Martin, according to what I see, you actually only managed to do that for 6 minutes and 30 seconds. So, so our last but not least contributor is a colleague of mine from Chatham House now, the one and only Charles Clift. Charles is a senior consulting fellow at the House and a board member of the Medicines Patent Pool, which is a Swiss charitable foundation, I'm sure many people here know, which seeks to increase access to medicine for people living with HIV and other diseases in emerging countries. It's had, like the others, which were so lucky for all four, has had a very illustrious career in many aspects of health, a lot of it as an economist at DFID, and in addition to his work at Chatham House, he's been a consultant to WHO and many other organisations that play such a vital role in this world. So, Charles, let me sum up what I thought I'd been asked to ask you, and then you've told me actually it's something else now. So I paraphrased it to, what is the context of everything that is in this report, in your view, in the political economy?
Yes. I was cunning enough to get my own question included. So I must accelerate. So I thought it'd be a good idea to start with a little quiz, because you've all been sitting there listening. And so this is a quotation from somebody, and you have to guess who it was. The drug lobby is making an absolute fortune at the expense of American consumers. No industry spends more money on lobbying than the pharmaceutical health products industry. Last year, these companies spent nearly $280 million on lobbyists. That's more than the tobacco, oil, and defense contractors combined. Health insurance companies and other providers spent another $200 million to protect the status quo and to keep prices artificially high. And they've been very successful doing it for many, many years. It's too easy.
He also says the post office gets screwed over by Amazon.
Yeah. So, and then he appoints a lobbyist to be his Secretary of Health and Human Services. And that was in a speech he gave earlier this year about lowering drug prices, which mainly seems to be about raising other people's prices. This is in Europe and Japan. Okay, so the serious point I want to make is the report somewhat ignores the political economy of how to make change happen. I think it implicitly assumes that governments want to do the right thing, but are somehow prevented by the machinations of the pharmaceutical industry. But actually, it is governments that prioritize the interests of their industries over other objectives. So in the case of pharmaceuticals, that's why we have the IP rules that we do. That is why governments press for TRIPS plus measures in trade agreements. That indeed is why we have the drug prices that we do. They are theoretically within the power of governments to alter incentives and systems to change it, but they choose not to. And maybe that's also why in the EU, US, and UK we prioritise public investment in biomedical research, because it feeds the goose that lays the golden egg, which is the pharmaceutical industry. And as the report says, Mariana's report says, the reward goes disproportionately to the industry rather than the public sector, which laid the foundations for its achievements. Then I'm fond of Republican US presidents, so I think this one is even easier than the last one. So So who said this? In the Council of Government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Everyone knows that one, I think. So the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial military machinery of defence with our peaceful methods and goals. So my suggestion is just change a few words, and you could be talking about the biomedical industrial complex and the influence not just that the industry has on governments, but also what Eisenhower went on later. Immediately after this, in his speech, which was his farewell speech, he started talking about the dangers that government-funded research would destroy the freedom of universities and so on. So as a Republican, he was clearly worried about the enhanced role of the state in research, which is exactly, I think, the opposite of what this report says, more important. But of course, it was Eisenhower who created DARPA, this thing we've referred to a lot, when the Russians launched Sputnik, and they wanted to catch up. So what this well, there's a recent report from Nesta in the UK which dwells on these themes. So it has much the same analysis of what's wrong with the pharmaceutical industry, the same graph of falling R&D productivity. But its argument is slightly different. It argues that the emphasis on biomedical science in health research is not well supported by evidence on impact or value for money. Rather, it reflects the power and influence of the research community in shaping research priorities and the allocation of resources. So what it's saying is there's a very powerful lobby, not just in the private sector, but in the public sector, which says biomedical research is the way to go, and devalues other kinds of research. So I think Martin was saying something similar to that. We need to look at problems more holistically. And this is also, I think, what the mission research is about. So you look at a problem, and then you think, what is the best way to address this problem? So it could be biomedical research, but it could be behavioral research. It could be climate change research. It could be all sorts of different things, but we want to avoid the distortion that it's natural. All biomedical scientists think more biomedical science must be a good thing, but it's not necessarily true. So we need somehow to take a more objective view of how we go about the research process. So the Nesta report also says a lot about DARPA-inspired missions. So there was actually one proposal in the UK last year by Sir John Bell, who did a report for government, who suggested we have something called HARP. Not HARPA, but HARP, but the same for Health Advanced Research Program. And that was also explicitly influenced by DARPA. So I've got 15 seconds. So I think my point is, if we want to affect meaningful change in the current system, we have to consider the political economy factors which favour the status quo. Many of the ideas in the report, which not all of which are new, have been discussed and debated for many years, but nothing much has happened which would enable many of them, or any, to be put into practice. So the secret in bringing about change will be in identifying a political constituency or alliance that is sufficiently strong to bring about change. So the big example that's used in public health recently is, why is the struggle against AIDS not yet completed, but why has it in many ways been successful? And it's a combination of a number of different factors to do with India, TRIPS, and so on. But critically, there was a vocal civil society movement, some of whom are here, and which was very influential on public policy and I've got 2 more lines.
15 seconds.
Well, you know. Okay, so the big question is whether in current circumstances we can generate something like the AIDS thing that would be transformative rather than just incremental. And I don't have the answer either, but I asked the question.
So thank you, Charles. As I just rudely said to him, we are on a very tight time now. Mariana, do you want to briefly reflect on what you've heard? And then she's eating into your 15 minutes to ask questions.
Already?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be super quick. Well, first, just to say thank you so much for these really insightful comments, of which I agree, I think, with most of them. I mean, let me almost work backwards, and I think Charles and Calypso's points actually resonate, or if you want, they relate. So the point about the political economy, I mean, maybe we should have said it more explicitly, and I'm not trying to be defensive. I'm actually thinking we need to rewrite some of the tone, because that was exactly our point, which is that when you don't have a focus on kind of the public purpose of of this massive amount of public investment, then you actually get captured very easily along the way. And the reason I mentioned John Abrams' work in the beginning was that this pharmaceuticalization of the research and overemphasis on the drugs and not enough on the diagnostic surgical treatments, lifestyle, or an obsession about particular drugs and not others, and the Me Tooization that Calypso was basically referring to is basically an outcome of capture. I mean, just call it capture, and it can be a mild capture and a strong capture, but it's when you actually allow, in some ways, the industry to define the priorities, but also how you get there. And Calypso's points, I mean, she said, could we actually just kind of fix the system by, the problems around advertising and evergreening? I mean, the real issue there is that the reason then that you also get captured is that the power relationships have been massively affected by the discourse. And I used to make fun of my postmodern friends in university, but now I kind of get what they were talking about, which is that language matters. When you do have this strong concept of value-based pricing and the value is created in the industry is the most innovative, it actually becomes much easier for them then to lobby for things that have actually then also extended these patents kind of ad infinitum. So, the Hatch-Waxman Act is an example in the US, which was used to extend even more patents simply if you tested a drug on also kids, then you got another 15 years or whatever, where, again, William Baumol talked about it as unproductive entrepreneurship as opposed to productive. But these kind of things like capture, they don't just happen. It's not like government's just waiting to get captured. It massively gets affected by these power relationships, which are results of how we describe the innovation system. The first point, Mariangela, when you talked about the car parts, and I sort of tried to, end with that when I said, should we just Walmartize the production, given that actually the huge spend and the complexity is the innovation process. And innovation is highly uncertain. Most of the, of it kind of fails, or indeed most of it fails. The guy who just won the Nobel Prize, by the way, Paul Romer, I think got one thing wrong. I'm sorry, because he got the prize. But when endogenous growth theory introduced innovation endogenously, they talked about it as risk, and risk is what you do when you have a lottery, right? You can actually calculate a probability distribution around it. But true uncertainty, which both Keynes and Knight talked about, endogenous growth theory actually can't handle. So the next Nobel Prize winner shall talk about uncertainty. And this is this is a sector that's massively affected by uncertainty. And the big question is, can the private sector actually deal with these really long-term cycles, 30 years kind of from superstar to when the drug's actually on the market, this highly complex, nonlinear, uncertain process. Well, they haven't, they tended to shy away from that part. That's why we don't have the Bell Labses, in the sector. And if they are going to focus more on the downstream, then perhaps, again, the rewards shouldn't be zero. This is not about communism, but they should be aligned with actually how much risk is really being taken and that kind of sharing of risks and rewards. Anyway, I'll stop because I really do think it's important to get to the audience.
Okay.
And I should say it'd be great to hear, at least at some point, also by the co-authors if they want to come.
So actually, rather, because now we literally only have 10 minutes, so can each of the other co-authors just I'll do something rather crass, just stand up so everybody can see who they are, and then in drinks afterwards you can chat and get real wisdom from these guys.
So we do have 15 minutes, yeah? It's till 5:30.
5:25 is end of Q&A, because then you're coming back to each of the panellists for final minute comments.
I don't think we need to.
Okay, all right, in that case we have 15 minutes. See? I get bullied. Opening comments.
So my name is Gerald, I work with Just Treatment, and just to come in on Charles Clift's point about how do we build a system that will work and can push the change and take into account the political reality is some of the work that we're doing. And I wanted to give a moment to Claire, who works with Just Treatment, to say about why this matters and what role she has and the people she works with has to make a difference. So I'm going to do that.
Yeah, I will be, yeah. So my name's Claire. I got involved with Just Treatment because this is, first of all, thank you everyone for kind of attending and for writing the report. But I was affected directly by the high prices of sofosbuvir, and I had to wait for it. And I had to wait for it while my health was getting worse. But to be told, I was constantly told I wasn't ill enough to actually kind of be given the treatment. I was given it eventually, but this for me is just kind of like, I think, a brilliant way forward, and I'm really, really hoping that some actions will come out of this. That's it.
So what I might do is, first of all, I'll take 3 questions together for any of people up here. Lady here, if you can all be brief, please.
I'm Colby Benari from UCL, and I'm just really curious to know what the panel have to say about the role of disruptive technology in potentially creating and helping to create the type of ecosystem that's described in the report, and its potential influence on the kind of non-drug aspects of healthcare.
We have somebody from the other room that's popped in. This is how popular this is. We have another room. Somebody from there has popped in. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, my name's Tavian. I'm from University's Allies for Essential Medicines. I was very interested in the comment you made at the end. Is it Dr. Clift or Dr. Clift? About kind of contextualising the report with regards to the political economy, and wondered, you mentioned allegiances that we could draw. I wondered if anyone else on the panel had any thoughts as to allegiances, whether within the current movement that we're in or kind of other broader movements, be it kind of around climate change or something like that we could draw parallels with or join forces with, and how that would work, basically.
A third question. This lady here.
I'm a lay member of a nice appraisal committee. My question is, how do we on our committee get out of where we are now? I mean, I'm getting out of it by saying I can't do it anymore because all the I've said I'm not taking a 10th year of this because the pressures on us are so enormous. I can see. Better be careful what I say, but I can see the pharmaceutical industry gaming the system. I totally believe in what you're talking about, but we are stuck in a place at the moment, and I don't know how we get from there to something better.
Okay, so whilst the panel is answering those, can I ask you to think of briefly any different kind of thematic questions if we have time left? So Charles, there was one very specific one to you, I think, so why don't we start with you or on that or anything else you want to briefly comment on?
I think it was to the other members of the panel.
Oh, sorry, it was. But anything else you want to talk about in any of the 3 questions?
I don't understand disruptive technology. This is
Okay, that's a very good answer. Martin?
Yeah, well, in anticipation of your question, our expert panel did actually write a report on disruptive innovation. So I would refer you to our website. But that said, essentially what we did do was to say this is full of the law of unintended consequences. And while disruption can be very helpful, it can be, it can be risky or uncertain, probably uncertain rather than risky, and you need to have mechanisms in place to monitor and evaluate and so on.
And on the political economy thing that...
Yeah, sure. But I think Mariana was really picking up on this point about power and language without getting into Foucault and all the rest of it. But we do a lot of work on the corporate determinants of health, and there the ability of vested interests to define the narrative by use of language is hugely important. I think this point I made about Lewis Carroll, who is actually probably the most useful philosopher in all of this. Alice in Wonderland helps us to understand a lot of the world today, Jam tomorrow and all the rest of it. Then I think the language, the choice of language is hugely important, and the way in which that has been captured and not always challenged.
Mariangela, any reflections on any of those three questions?
I actually have a reflection on what Mariana said about the risks that companies take on research and development and so on. But there's a lot of that we need to think. What's a sustainable return on investment? What constitutes a fair profit in a way? No, we are not against profit, but what's a sustainable return on investment that will allow innovation to be? And that's different from going.
Mariana, yourself on any of these?
Just on the disruptive technology, and also related to something else that we said at some point, is one thing that, I use the word mission-oriented in terms of the policies, but, one thing that we've done in Europe, and actually IIPP was, I think, pivotal to coming to also writing the report on missions, is that what also we mean by missions is that if you focus on a problem, think of all the problems both in health and energy, they all require sort of lots of different sectors to actually tackle them. So going to the moon required over 12 different sectors and 300 homework problems to get there. And I think the word disruptive technology doesn't actually capture that, it's AI, big data will obviously be essential to, the future of the welfare state, let alone in particular health. And the question is that all of these can be used for different things. So, for example, big data has been used a lot for personalized medicine, but hasn't actually been used for, if you want, other elements of the healthcare system, or even if you want just of healthy living. So if you look at how we've decided who in this country is allowed to stay living in a housing estate or who's not, this bedroom tax, it's like negative big data. It's like, how many bedrooms do you have? How many kids do you have? Is one number bigger than the other one? You're out. It's like, okay, that was complex. And so we make choices of where to apply the power of AI and big data and these disruptive technologies. And this concept of missions is really important because that's how we frame in a concrete way these challenges that we have ahead. And then the real question is how to use everything government has at its power, grants, loans, procurement power, et cetera, to really then drive in, bottom-up experimentation. But these technologies are, if you want, they should be seen as kind of the GPTs, the general purpose technologies that then allow you to confront those problems, but they need leadership.
Okay, let's try another quick round. Gentleman here has a question.
John Abraham, King's College London. I just wanted to add a comment to Charles's argument, which is partly optimistic and partly pessimistic. So I think on the optimistic side, over the last 30 years, we now have more people working on issues, let's put it that way, about the pharmaceutical industry, and an awful lot more knowledge about what's wrong with the sector, hugely more knowledge about what's wrong with the sector. So that should at least provide the knowledge base for trying to change things. The other positive thing is, although you're right that governments often prioritise the interests of the industry over wider public health interests, and you can see that when you get into the documents about government machinations, it's also the case that even within capitalist countries, you can see vast differences in the extent to which they do that. So you can look at certain periods of certain government governance and government regulation and so on off the industry and say that's much more distributing in the interests of public health than another model of governance in another country and so on. So there's the possibility of arguing for those sorts of different approaches which prioritise interests of public health. I think on the pessimistic side is that in addition to the issue that you raised in terms of the political economy and how governments distribute interests, in more recent times, and I'm thinking now maybe the last 10 to 15 years or more, there's something else going on which is more powerfully ideological. It's a sort of commitment to some sort of purist neoliberal free market kind of economics, which is more than just about how is the government going to distribute interest between industry and various other interests. You know, the sort of managerial capitalism. There's an additional ideological thing that's got to be confronted, I think.
Well, that's not unique to this business.
Indeed, it is not. Indeed, it is.
Point made. Other questions, very, very quickly. Gentleman in front of you.
Just to talk numbers, there are 750 million people who have illness who are being treated for it. It costs about $8 trillion a year. That's one population. It's 10% of the global population. The other population is about 22% that actually are transitioning into disease, that is, chronic diseases, between the ages of about 45 and 65. And that is our next challenge, because prevention is better than cure, and we're not spending hardly any money on that at all. No.
Okay, so that wasn't a question either. Lady behind the first guy.
Hi, I'm Nikki Johnson from Health Foundry. So we work on a day-to-day basis with health tech entrepreneurs who are really feeling the problems in the health innovation ecosystem. I'm just curious, what advice would you give to the people who are facing those challenges on a day-to-day, and how can they impact this on a grassroots level?
One last question over here, then I'll come back to the panel to reflect on the two comments on that question and anything else you want to reflect on. But last question.
Patents hold really tightly for pharmaceutical innovations. Should they be shorter than the non-pharma regulations?
Okay, why don't we start this way this time? No? Martin?
Oh, okay. I'll pick up on maybe two other points. Governments are not monolithic. I mean, governments are not all the same. And I'm not sure if anybody else here has been involved in a lot of the discussions under the Austrian EU presidency with member states. And you've got the Benelux A group, you've got the Southern European group, who are taking an entirely different, in the meetings, entirely different perspective from certain other governments in Europe. So the views are almost polarised, actually. So really key point. Yeah, I mean, prevention, of course, but most prevention doesn't require money, because actually if we really want to deal with the big problems in this world, it is about price, availability and marketing. It's not individual level measures. It's about tackling the things like sugar-sweetened beverages, tobacco, and so on, that's actually damaging health. Now, often you can even make money out of that by taxing them and so on. The one thing that perhaps does cost some money, but it's not an awful lot, that would make a huge difference in our work and others, is if we could control hypertension globally. And that can be done with cheap generic drugs, but we're not doing it. And even in high-income countries, only about half of the people who are treated, or half of the people with it, are actually treated. So prevention doesn't cost a lot of money. We should do a lot more of it. Charles?
Well, I think Professor Abrahams, is it? Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate all those points. I mean, the other point I was going to say about HIV/AIDS was, one thing was the activism. The other thing, that it came at a point in time when governments were prepared to open their purse strings and create new funding bodies, like the Global Fund, like PEPFAR, like Gavi. The situation, I think, couldn't be more different now, both politically and economically. So I suppose that's a pessimistic point.
And the very last words, Mariana, of course, on anything here or anything else you want to leave with the audience.
I think the question of what's next and what are the kind of allegiances, which again came up before. So one is, there's a little box in the report by Charlie Ledbetter, who wrote a book called We Think, and who's part of IIPP's Commission on Mission-Oriented Industrial Strategy. And he talks a lot about movements. He says, so many of things that we might call a mission, actually there was a movement behind it. And, that's really important, because I just said before that we need leadership. But if you look, for example, at Germany, the Energiewende mission, which today is really transforming on the energy side, that's different from health, production distribution across many different sectors, that came after 40 years of a green movement, and not even just the Green Party, the green movement, which then, later was able to be harnessed and really elaborated quite well as a top-down mission. But I think, again, think of the ACT UP movement that then led to, AIDS, or the birth control movement, which then ended up with the birth control pill. I think we need to better think of how those things happen, right? So it's not just about leadership, and then, yes, civil society. There's lots of talk about civil society, but it often just becomes this big kind of bag that's everything but business and government. I think on the academic side, we should really understand better what we're talking about when we talk about missions and movements and the relationship. But for sure, in order to get strong movements that become a real thorn in the side around the issues that I think we've all been raising in terms of also what is funded, also this issue around preventative, there's, interesting, if you want, allegiances that could be made, but also to focus less, I would almost say, on the fairness question, because everyone knows it's completely wrong when you have such a high price that people are dying not because they're sick, but literally they can't afford the drug. What I think the weaker battle that's been fought is actually undermining the value proposition behind those high prices. And so in a world of, where everyone's talking about fake news, and I would say it's, half the time it's not fake news, it's lies. These are two different words. I don't want to use the words too strongly now in terms of lies, but there are really problematic assumptions behind the justifications for these high prices. And I think having a really strong, vocal community that unveils, that problem around the definition of value, I think that's a really open spot to immediately put attention to, and then again turn it into a broader coalition.
Okay, well, thank you to particularly our panellists that have volunteered their time for this, both for being so concise but so powerful in what you've said, and then of course to Mariana and all the contributors, and to all of you in the audience. Your reward, I gather, is drinks outside. Thank you.